You ever had a story or an event that changes how you see things in an instant? It happened to me a few years ago when I saw this picture of a little boy lying on a beach. Looked like he was asleep. His face was turned up to the side. His little bum kind of a little bit in the air, as you see with toddlers. 2 years old. But he wasn't sleeping. His name was Alan Kurdi. And he was lying on a beach in Turkey, washed up on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, with his mom, his brother, and 9 other people. All drowned as they fled Syria in search of a new and more peaceful life. Alan Kurdi's family coming to Canada. That image was in September 2015. And it not only rocked my world, but it rocked the world. Because it was the first time that a face described a crisis that had been going on for years. There was nothing new about the crisis of Syrian refugees at the time. Before young Alan Kurdi drowned, more than 2,500 people had drowned in similar circumstances as they were leaving Syria. 200,000 refugees, more. But this image of a dead child on a beach was this powerful light bulb moment that the label Syrian refugee was not faceless. It was not nameless. It was people. It was more than a 30-second soundbite that you idly pay attention to and go, "Ugh, that sounds awful," and then continue sipping your cup of tea. It was perhaps for the very first time that I really internalized the idea that beneath the labels, Syrian refugees were individual people, just like we are, individual people who would give anything, including their lives, for a chance to watch the evening news and sip a cup of tea. And in thinking about this and reflecting on what it meant for me, and trying to make sense of what it could express like for me, I started to think about the power of the label. From the moment we're born, labels are applied to us. Gender, race, nationality. As we get older, we learn to apply labels too, including things like our role in the family and our parents' role to us. And labels have a purpose. They help us to understand information about each other, help us to recognize who we are in the greater community. And we mess things up, though, when we start applying meanings to these labels and then believing the meanings we apply and then treating people according to the label instead of according to their humanity. It is with labels that we decide who we'll welcome, who we'll turn away from, who we'll ostracize, who is friend, who is foe. And at times, at its extreme, it has the tendency and possibility to dehumanize and divide. it's as if we take labels, and I think of them as like sticky notes, but different colors. So, red sticky note, person we want to stay away from. Green sticky note, someone who's in our circle, in our community, on our side. Red sticky note, stay away from. Green, on our side. Separate, separate, separate. And then we take care of the green, and we turn away from the red. The problem, of course, is who decides the color? Because the people who are in the red community are also a community, and they're likely seeing us on another side as red, and they see themselves as green, and it's confusing. Because what's true about labels is they are sticky. Think of them as sticky notes. When we have this division, we have we are right. W-A-R, war. Surely the goal, if we are living in a place where we want to increase the love on the planet, we want to increase peace on the planet, we want to increase the strength of our relationships on the planet and in our homes and in our workplaces and in our friendship circles, then surely one of the most powerful things we can do is to resolve to see beneath the label, to the place where we actually all pretty much want the same thing. We all pretty much want a certain level of security for us and for our families. We all pretty much want to be able to be seen and heard and respected and at least understood. And when we put ourselves into a place of war, red labels, green labels, when we dehumanize, when we separate, when we treat people in a way that is not equal, when we treat people as less than, then the harm that that can create can last for generations. It is not the way to build on a future of acceptance and live and let live. And the challenge of that, of course, is that it's hard to see beneath the label. And what happens when we've been the person on the receiving end of the label? Hasn't it hurt our feelings? At the most, at the least, if we're completely evolved, maybe it won't matter. But for most of us, if somebody says something to us or treats us in a way that feels icky because of a judgment that they have made, because of a label they have applied to us, it doesn't feel good. And at its extreme, it can lead to persecution and genocide and war. In the greater, in our relationships, in our families, maybe not too far from that either. The idea of you don't have a voice, you are not respected. These labels, they hide our stickiness, our humanness. And so I want you to think of them as sticky notes. And then the invitation has to be that we disable the label. Recognize labels will always be part of our human condition. We use it to make things organized. That's nothing wrong with that. It's when those labels start to make us go apart, that we find harm in our life and in our relationships. So I'll echo Barb Good, who says labels are for jars, not for people. So if I could convince you that labels are for jars, not for people, then how can we disable the label in our lives? I'll give you 4 ideas, one in order, next in order, one after the other. The first is to notice it. Notice when we label. At our youth group the other night, one of the things we read was something about people being extras in our story. And I loved that concept. Like, how often do we see other people as insignificant extras in our story? And it doesn't feel great. Some of you have heard this story from me because it's an example of another one of these light bulb moments for me that I've carried with me forever. And that was a time when I was running for the bus, late as usual. And that bus driver, he saw me running, and he kept going. And I hear, Why? Because it was an experience of feeling like I did not matter. Yeah. I was an extra in his story, and he had other things that he had to focus on. I could have been just another thing on the side of the road. It would not have mattered. It was one of the most dehumanizing experiences I've ever had. And it was a lesson. Because from that, I started to think about how often I see other people as extras in my story. Whether it's people close to me, like my spouse or my family, or whether it's people that I have interactions with, servers and people at the grocery store. How often am I so focused on what I need to get done, as this driver was, that I don't see the humanity of the person? Instead, I just see them as a role that they're playing in my life. It was an epic wake-up call for me. And I will admit quite freely that my first response was not very holy. It had some not very nice words in it. And it was such a great lesson. So I wonder if you might consider, first, noticing the places where you see through the person and don't see the person. The fare, the server, the spouse, they're not just extras in your play. They're people. Why is it so important? Well, the more that we uplift and treat people with kindness, the more we uplift everyone. If you believe that we are all interconnected, then surely a kind word that uplifts somebody else will uplift them and perhaps inspire them to have a kind word to someone else, and so on and so on. There's a ripple effect in every interaction that we have. We have the power to change somebody's life. This guy certainly did, but he ended up having it for the better. Thank you, jerk. A rising tide lifts all boats. When we act with kindness and consideration, it can have a ripple effect. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to consider is this week in homework. Just notice how often you see someone as the spouse, the daughter, the boss, the role, the label. And then, step 2, notice the person. In her book, Barb, who wrote the book, The Good Life, describes this perfectly. This is a title that she has in a section called Changes in Labels Over the Years. It reads, and I quote from Barb, defective became insane, became retarded, became mentally handicapped, became mentally challenged, became developmentally delayed, became intellectually challenged, became people with mental handicaps, became people with disabilities. Do you see how long it took for people to come before disability? Another mind-blowing moment. Such wise words. How often do we put the label before the person? Can we switch it around and do so in our language? The people who are, insert label here. It not always easy to do that. So one of the things that we want to consider is, how do we find the person beneath the label? Well, if it's strangers, we can do it very simply with a smile or making a little quip, talking about the weather, little things that take us out of the role of extra and into the role of connector. And sometimes, as I said, it's not easy because we're so used to our roles being as they are. We have patterns that we're so familiar with. So somehow we want to get a little closer and connect with the people before we assign a label. At some point then the labels disappear. Once we get to that, and if you can do those two things, notice the label, connect to the person, that is enough. That is enough. But if you want to go even further, then we move to a place where real change can happen. And that is where we question the fairness of the status quo. Unity does not require conformity. And if it weren't for people questioning the status quo, then there are lots of things in our society that today we take for granted that would still be back in what we consider the Dark Ages. Our accepted norms are often based on a double standard, where it's okay for me to see things a certain way, but not for you to see things in a certain way. And it's hard sometimes to see our blind spots. So, can we look at how we treat people and question whether or not it's equal? Is it fair? Is it respectful? It wasn't that long that women didn't have a right to vote or to go to school. It wasn't that long ago that people of color were not allowed to use the same bathrooms or swimming pools or buses or live in the same areas as people with skin that was not of color. It wasn't not that long ago that people who were the first peoples of this nation were shipped away for no other reason than because they weren't the label that was the prevailing power of the day. All of these such painful examples of how we dehumanize our brothers and sisters. The late, great Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was the second female Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, said that she was sometimes asked, when will there be enough women on the Supreme Court? And she would say, when there are 9. And people would be shocked. But her response was, but there had been 9 men, and nobody ever raised a question about that. Boo! What's good for the goose must be good for the gander, as my mama would say. Question the status quo. Put your name in the other person's place and see if it would feel okay for you to be in those shoes. And insist on no unequal or dehumanizing treatment. And that leads to my final point, and that is to stand up for your values. When we realize that we've been applying labels and we realize that we've been accepting some double standards, the next step is to be willing to stand up, to change it, to be a dissenting opinion. Jesus was a dissenter on many occasions. He touched people who had leprosy and were considered unclean, and it was against the law, the Jewish law, to touch people who were unclean. He healed on the Sabbath, even though the rule was that you were to do no work, including healing, on the Sabbath. He challenged the religious leadership, the scribes and the Pharisees, and he called them hypocrites. It's probably not the best way to make friends and influence people, but he challenged the status quo. He challenged them to focus on doing the right thing rather than doing things right. Sometimes doing things right is the law, and that is not always the same as doing the right thing. What he said about that is in Matthew chapter 23, verse 23, and he says this, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the other." How often can we be absolutely marvelous at taking care of the little things that really don't matter? The perfect house, the perfectly set table, and be absolutely blind to the things that matter more. Being present with people, being fair, being just, being kind. When we insist on change, it is not always an easy process. Change is always a bit of an uncomfortable invitation. But it begins with an idea. It begins with someone floating a new possibility. And sometimes it takes a while for that new possibility to take hold. Float it anyway. Do you think that the first person who said women should have a right to vote was heard? Probably not. But it sowed an idea that caused another idea, that led to another idea, that created a motion, that created a movement that finally changed. The dissenter does not write for today. They write for tomorrow. Another of Justice Ginsburg's wise words. They don't write for now. They write to do things right in the future. So, notice how you label. Consider going beneath the label. Unstick the stickiness. Disable the label and see the person beneath. Beneath the label of Syrian refugee was an innocent child. Alan Kurdi. Notice the label, then notice the person. If you do that much, that's your homework for the week. And if you want to take it a step further, question the fairness of the assumptions that we see. And ask yourself if you would be okay if your family or your friends were treated that way. And if the answer is no, then have the courage to take a stand. It may be a small step towards shedding light on a previously unrecognized problem or overlooked norm. Labels are for jars, not for people. Remove the sticky notes, see the humanity beneath, and shift your world, our world, from labels to love. I bless you.